the concept of kinesthetic awareness, so knowing how your body's moving really in space, and like having that physiological intuition where, okay, I know, like anyone who tries to tell someone how to deadlift, they'll say, keep your back straight. How do you know, if you've never touched that bar and you've never got in that position, if your back's straight or not? So, like, when you're building those foundations, would you be kind of talking to them about their body in space? Would you be kind of getting them to feel, this is what knees out feel, this is what toes and heels feel like on the floor, and stuff like that?
Yeah. I think those type of cues are very difficult to do from a remote setting. It's really beneficial for somebody to be able to see videos. So that's really cool about the remote. But unless you're on site with the client, it's really difficult to do those type of coaching cues unless they really understand kind of what you're saying, typing it out. But I think just starting out with what, kinesthetics is the receptors, in the muscles and tendons. They're going to inform our brain about, the position, the shape, the effort that we're going to do, and how we're moving throughout space. So that's really what's going to allow us to understand body movement. And so I think that's understanding really what kinesthetics is and like how it's important and how it can apply to training is a really good starting point. But I think, the lack of kinesthetics definitely increases the chance for us to injure ourselves when we transition into the loading phase of movement.
Yeah. So would you say that training is almost like double-headed, where you're training the movement, but you're trying to embed that awareness of how your body's moving before you chuck on load?
Yeah, exactly. Awareness is huge. And it definitely comes back to your approach of why you're training. So if you're training just because you think you have to, you're not going to have that mentality of, I want to be aware of how I'm moving. How can I connect this movement and these phases of the movement to my body? Am I understanding? Am I feeling those? You can do it like we talked about earlier. You can do an air squat multiple different ways. Somebody can bounce down, bounce up real fast, air squat. Somebody can slow down.
With a nice crack in their knees.
Yeah. And they're like, oh, I got bad knees. And that's so true, though. You tell them to do an air squat, and the first thing they do is they just drop. They have to come down instead of, hey, let's control that.
Yeah, there's no eccentric at all, is there? There's no eccentric. There's no antagonist.
But unfortunately, that's a perfect example that it takes time to learn that.
Yeah.
It definitely takes time to for people to connect that with their brain. It's not just our bodies moving. It's the whole thing together, for sure.
Sick. So the final question before we move on to programming that I wanted to ask, and we have touched on it, but I'd like to go a little bit further into it, is why should beginners not work to failure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the concept of working to failure definitely is derived from the bodybuilding industry, for sure. Big muscular guys on Instagram or on YouTube that they're just crushing these. They're in a leg press or they're in a seated leg curl with their trainer, right? And their trainer's like half.
I've literally got an image right now in my head of Martin Ford, just like, one more rep. No, don't you get up, one more rep.
Yeah, right? And they're like halfway sitting on it, and the person's like borderline crying because it hurts so bad. The average person, that, we have to understand that what those people are doing, they're in the sport of bodybuilding. So if you're going to like that's your full-time job, it can be some excruciating stuff. It's a hard work. No doubt bodybuilders are hard. People will say they don't, they do. It's why they look that way. You can't just, even if they're injecting steroids, you can't just inject steroids.
You've got to have a stimulus, haven't you, for muscle to grow.
Exactly. So not to, wrap anybody that does bodybuilding at all, in that form or that aspect, but to the general person, that's just not realistic. Keep in mind, not just physiologically, but there's a mental side to training to failure. And if, like I said, if you're in the beginner phase of that training age, there's no reason we should train to failure. It can be very intimidating. You're going to be very sore the next, week. Somebody who's not used to that, they walk into that and they try that. Why do I feel this way? They may think something's wrong with them the next week.
Yeah.
It's not, they're not developed enough Musculature, physiologically, they're not developed enough in order to take that type of stimulus. It's not completely wrong. I think there's a time for it, but even if you're at the top of the strength, it's not something that should be every day in your program either.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's something that you can maybe experience with a little bit down the road. I personally don't train a lot to failure. I think tempo training is a little bit more realistic because you can maybe feel like you're training to failure, but you're moving a lot. You're just to crank out a bunch of dumbbell curls. Maybe it is to failure every once in a while, but I just think that mental aspect can be very tough on the beginner.
I think the important thing what we're saying is that when you are training failure, it's a muscle belly. It's not a joint that you're working across. It's not failing at the hip or failing at the back or failing at the shoulder joint. It's failing, for example, a core workout, an arch hold, for example. You sometimes work to failure, but it's not that you're putting any strain on a joint. It's all going to be from the core, which is the muscle belly. So I think that's a bit more sensible kind of approach to training to failure.
Exactly.